We're going to go ahead and get started, guys. People are rolling in a little bit, but I value your time, so I don't want us to go over too much in case people have other things to do, as if none of us do. Just to go over things real quickly again. If you happen to have called in with a phone number and not your name, I can read off those digits. I would like you to please do me a solid and go ahead and put your name in the chat. I know that we got the person with the 708 area code that was 9190. We've got you. Area code 815, last four digits is 1122. Hi, Shallon. If you can sign in, that would be awesome. And then 815 area code, the last four for you are 8540. That would be wonderful. Anna's not on today, guys. She had a sort of a family emergency situation, so it's me flying by myself. I'm Katie. I am the director of the Illinois Crisis Prevention Network in the Springfield area, and I also do supervision duties in the Hillside area, our Chicagoland team. And today, we're going to be talking about trauma-informed care. And right towards the very, very end, we're going to hit a little bit of compassion fatigue and some validation as well, because those are topics that all seem to go well together. And I think they're also super timely. I mentioned earlier, give us about 2 weeks or so for CEUs. If you do not get them, I've already put my email address and Anna's in there as well. You can email either one of us. I will also put our emails back in at the end of the presentation so that they pop back up for everybody real easily. I'm going to try and monitor the chat box pretty well throughout the entire presentation. So if you could all do me a favor and go ahead and make sure that when you type something in the chat feature, that the drop-down menu that says to, it says everyone, so that everyone can see your questions and comments. So people can have a bit of an interactive experience, hopefully, even though this isn't our normal because it's not in person. So without further ado, I'm going to hit the ground running and share my screen. We're going to talk about trauma-informed care and how important it is. And I'm really hoping that I don't have to necessarily sell any of you on the idea of how important this is, but I'll do what I can today. A little bit of information and background about me. My name is, like I said, it's Katie. And I have been the director of the Springfield office now for 9 years for SST. I'm a board certified behavior analyst, a school psychologist. And before working for SST, I did a lot of behavior work for residential agencies and also worked in the school system as a school psychologist. So I've worked a couple of different places and certainly doing what I do for SST, I go into a lot of different group homes or family homes and scenarios. And I have found without a shadow of a doubt that trauma-informed care can be truly transformative in how we work with people, how we assess their needs, and how we really help them get to a better place, not just behaviorally, but within all aspects of their life. So we're going to talk about trauma-informed care today. I encourage you guys to ask questions. I encourage you to chat. I will not be monitoring the Q&A section or raising hands. So please, please, please just use the chat function. That will make it a little easier for me. And let's get going. So I think the first thing that we should establish is what the heck is trauma-informed care? And really it's not some super prescriptive sort of curriculum that we utilize when working with people, but it's an approach to treatment that works on emphasizing the individual's history and how the effects of that history can change how they might behave or how they might see the world and interact with others. It provides us with a number of principles for how we should be treating the individuals that we work with. So it's not something super prescriptive. It's not like there's 4 different steps and you're done. It's something that is currently in use a lot of places and is constantly evolving because trauma is a very, very sort of flexible thing. And people who have had trauma histories can have trauma happen again to them. It's not like it's a one and done sort of situation. And the reality is that all of us have had trauma in our lives. And the vast majority of the individuals we work with have probably had trauma as well. So we're going to talk about all of that and maybe draw some from our own personal experiences, as well as I'll be giving you some examples of how knowing people's trauma has made an impact on how we've treated them and how it's impacted their behaviors within SST. So we know what trauma-informed care is, sort of. Now we're going to talk about what the heck is actual trauma. What does that really mean? The word cloud over here lists a ton of different words that could be related to trauma. And there are so many that are out there because trauma is highly individualized. It is not one size fits all. And what it is essentially is when an event or a different set of circumstances has a really long-term effect on someone, you're left feeling incredibly fragile, incredibly vulnerable. Your resiliency is not at all what it should be or what it typically is. It's really, really common for people to actually experience that trauma over and over again. Sometimes that can get to be a very intense situation, more along the lines of PTSD. Most people don't have PTSD that have trauma. And in fact, if that were the case, we'd all have PTSD. But some people will have even more intense trauma that leads to that. And typically what we're going to see is when people re-experience their trauma, it's when the variables and the situations in their lives sort of come back to the stimuli that was a part of the trauma initially. So you might know someone who had a trauma history with, let's say something like tornadoes, right? So anytime the tornado siren would go off, or there'd be a threat of severe weather, to them, that might be enough to sort of get them back into that headspace or experience that trauma all over again. And I'll actually be able to give you some examples related to those things as well. So what are some signs and symptoms of trauma? I will say there's a really wonderful publication from the ARC that lists a whole bunch of really great stuff. And it's called How Trauma Affects People with Intellectual Disabilities. But we're going to go over these. And I think it's really important when we talk about the signs and symptoms of trauma. These are not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. And not every single person will experience every single one of these symptoms. And just having these symptoms doesn't necessarily always mean trauma, because there are other mental health difficulties that could be related to some of these. So I don't want us to sort of take this and apply it like you guys might have done like I did when I took my intro to psych class and suddenly thought I had every diagnosis under the sun, because it's like, oh my God, I experienced that. Trauma is something that's highly individualized, like I've already said. So we need to be aware of all of these things and that they could be trauma, but they're not necessarily always trauma. So one of the big things that we might see is that new disruptive behaviors might sort of appear out of nowhere, or someone will start to display behaviors that they had a long time ago that we all thought were sort of cared for and under control. That happens fairly frequently with individuals who have trauma, is they will sort of re-experience that trauma, relive it, and those things will come back to fruition. Those things will come back to the forefront of their needs at the time. So that's why I think it's always important, if you have individuals who have a trauma history, if they had behaviors surrounding that trauma, even if those behaviors aren't active at the time, within their paperwork somewhere, their social history, their discovery tool, whatever your role is within their life, and the right place to document it, make sure it's documented. Make sure that that information appears in their history, so that if something were to happen and they were to move to a new agency or a new state, or all of their paperwork was lost except your document, that information would travel with them. Because I think that's one of the things that we see typically within trauma that becomes a bit hard is sometimes people's histories are not thoroughly documented in a bunch of places. And so as things sort of get misplaced because life, we might be missing some of that history. And that's especially important for the individuals we work with who don't necessarily have really excellent verbal skills, because they can't tell us what it is that they experienced with their words. So they might have to use other methods to get those things across. We might see people attention seeking from others. That's a big behavior we see with trauma victims, because they have this strong desire to confide in people, especially people that they trust or that they value. And they might want to spend extra time with them and seek more attention because that person is a safe person. And a huge part of trauma is trying to find safety, trying to find people that you can let yourself be more vulnerable around, that you can let your guard down a bit, because people with trauma are in a state of hyperarousal and sometimes literal fight or flight. and then building sort of walls around themselves. People might have nightmares and flashbacks. In fact, I'm working with a gentleman right now who has experienced some really significant trauma with the death of a roommate. And he wakes up, it started to happen more recently, but he wakes up maybe once, twice a month, and it'll be the middle of the night. We can't determine anything else in the house that has happened with him that could cause this, but he'll wake up and be just very, very upset, and to the point where he's physically aggressive. And we have looked through every potential variable that there is, and we can't find anything other than maybe this is a nightmare. And so he's waking up extremely, extremely agitated and struggling. Elizabeth, yes, we can talk about that, definitely. Attention-seeking behaviors. Elizabeth asked about attention-seeking behavior that might look like both positive and negative behaviors. It could just be that maybe you've got an individual that you work with who has sort of become like Velcro to you, right? They want to be near you at all times. They constantly are seeking out your physical presence. Or maybe there's someone who has a cell phone and they call you constantly, right? Someone who's calling constantly, always wanting to talk to you. And every single time they want to sort of rehash things that happened in their past. That could be an attention-seeking behavior. And sometimes that can be great. If that person's next to you, maybe you know that they haven't eloped or they're not engaging in physical aggression or property destruction. That can also be negative because there are times where you cannot have them near you because you have other things to do, right? Or HIPAA is a part of all of our jobs, so they can't be your Velcro person. That's not realistic. Some negative attention-seeking behaviors, other ones. I think the phone calls are one that are really, really good. It's not realistic for you to be able to take 17, 18 phone calls a day from someone who's struggling, no matter what your role is. That's just not a realistic expectation. Some people have figured out that big bad behaviors get the most attention from their staff. So they're going to engage in the big bad ones, maybe eloping, right? That's inherently potentially very dangerous. So you might end up working with someone who elopes because it gets a ton of staff attention. And then that's the moment that they start to bring up maybe some of that past trauma because maybe they've attempted some less intense behaviors and those haven't gotten them the assistance they're hoping for. So they might try those things. And I'll definitely talk about some other behaviors as well. And hopefully that helped, Elizabeth. If not, please feel free to say so, because I can try and give some more examples. So we might also see that people have sleeplessness or difficulty concentrating, especially if they are reliving their trauma or dealing with nightmares. The idea of going to sleep and potentially having to deal with that all over again is really tough. I'm sure most of us have at some point in time had a dream that felt really real, and you wake up and you're sort of still in that emotional state. Like I've had dreams where in my dream, my sister and I got into a fight and I woke up just distraught, crying, so upset. And we didn't have a fight. You know, she and I get along really well. She annoys the heck out of me, but she's my little sister. She's supposed to. But then I'll wake up in sort of that state where it's like I need to text her or call her and say, are we okay? Because I had this dream. The same thing might be happening for the individuals that we work with. They might be having these very intense dreams, and so they don't want to go to sleep. Or they're so tired, they're struggling to concentrate. A lack of energy, that can also be a part of it. Maybe an excessive fear of others. And typically the examples I'll give today of people that I have worked with are, some of them are going to be very intense or extreme. Some of them are going to be pretty benign compared to some other things. Oh, Elizabeth, that's really interesting. Oh my gosh, I can only imagine that there are a number of difficulties and trauma experiences related to that population. My goodness. Excessive fear of others might be a part of that, actually, you know, because if we don't know that person's history, especially what happened to them, what did someone do to them, that can be hard. And I'll talk very extensively about a young woman that we worked with years ago who was just an excellent example of the need for staff to be trauma informed. And then also people who have the ability to speak and tell us verbally what's going on. And I say speak, not even verbally, if there's someone who can use PECS or sign or type, you know, however it is that they communicate. They might repeat statements about an event that to us seems to come out of nowhere or not be related to other things. But maybe that individual needs to know that that situation isn't going to happen, or that they're safe from that thing. And the best way for them to do it is to have someone actually validate that and say, yes, that's not going to happen, or no, that person isn't in your life. Other signs and symptoms, people might appear to be distracted. Certainly, if your mind is in a place where you are just focused on survival, right, most basic of human needs, you're not going to be able to concentrate on some other things. People might have phobic mannerisms or avoid their triggers. It's completely understandable. If you have been through trauma and there's a very specific trigger for you, you're maybe going to avoid those things. Certainly limit your exposure until you feel that you can handle those things more. People might also engage in self-soothing behaviors, things that make them feel better, that can help them relax and calm. We might see a decline in skill development, which also correlates with sometimes the onset of bedwetting and bowel accidents. In particular, if we've been able to rule out any sort of decline in medical skills, like, for example, someone who has dementia or some sort of a degenerative disease that has to deal with the bowel or the bladder. Very, very commonly, individuals who've been sexually abused will start to display an onset of bedwetting and bowel accidents. And the simplest way to explain that is that if you are someone who is odorous and maybe potentially not super clean, you are less likely to be sexually assaulted. You're less likely to go through those experiences. So sometimes people will go ahead and void their bowel and bladder at times that they haven't before, or not necessarily appropriate times, because it's a way to keep themselves a bit safer. Yes, David, 100%. In fact, we've got clients that we've worked with that they don't necessarily want to go to the bathroom or be in the bathroom with anyone that's a staff person, because that is where their abuse occurred. I worked with one gentleman a couple of times now, and I'm trying to think of the most professional way to say this. He really dislikes anyone being in the bathroom with him. We've probed his family many, many times to see if we can get an idea of what trauma history there might be. They are unfortunately not the most open to those conversations. And so we have a strong suspicion that some pretty significant abuse happened to him in the bathroom, which is why he really strongly wants to be alone in there. But he's also not someone who is super skilled at cleaning himself. And so when we've worked with him, we've had to go through and find ways to mitigate that so that he can have the privacy that he wants in the bathroom, but also get clean. And yes, behavior communicates. We're working with another gentleman right now who, when he discusses places that you might have sexual intercourse, it is always related to the bathroom. And he's not someone that we know of who has had any sort of consensual sexual experience. We know for sure that there was at least one non-consensual experience that happened in the bathroom. So that's really helpful. Jennifer, bidets can be a great idea. That can be something that's helpful too. And you have to figure out what works for that person. Questions that seem to come out of nowhere. That can be a big one for people who are experiencing trauma as well, just that level of reassurance that they need. And then we can also see changes in sleep or eating patterns. People become isolated socially, they become irritable. So when we look at all of these potential signs and symptoms, like I said before, this isn't all of them, not even close, but all of these things, or many of these things, could also be related to other mental health conditions. So we need to be sure that we are looking at someone with sort of fresh eyes and not necessarily just jumping down the trauma pathway and forgetting something else that may have happened to them. But these can certainly be related to trauma. So what are some common traumas that individuals with developmental disabilities might experience? The number one is probably going to be neglect. And neglect can take a lot of different forms. Some that we might see more commonly are that someone was maybe locked in a bedroom, didn't have access to other portions of the home, parked in front of the television. I worked in the school system, like I said before this, and I knew a number of children who had no exposure to pre-academic skills or even appropriate television before they got to the school system. And so they appeared to have really significant deficits. And then once we started to work with them, it became clear that they just didn't have exposure to the appropriate things, or, educational TV for kids. So being stuck in front of the TV all day, as adults, if we want to sit in front of Netflix all day and just zone out, that's a choice we get to make. But for children, that's not necessarily the best thing. Malnutrition is quite common, especially if you have someone who tends to hoard food, excuse me, or take food items into their room and try and hide them. We see that a lot, that people who have not had good access to food will try and hide food and hoard it so that they always have a spare stash just in case. And then many transitions across caretakers, across staff. Individuals who are living in group homes inevitably have a certain level of staff turnover. But if it's someone who has lived in many, many different environments, say, for example, someone who's been within the DCFS system and never quite landed in the right foster home or adoptive home for them, they may have had tons of transitions. And each one of those transitions, maybe it was to a slightly better home or a better fit for them, but each one of those transitions is a big deal. They suddenly have to figure out, what does this person have as far as rules for me? Am I going to have access to food? Do I have my own room? Who else lives in this house? Can I trust any of them? Will I ever get to see my family again or my siblings again? I'm going to a new school. I've got new teachers. Those transitions are huge, and they can have a tremendous impact on people. Physical abuse is also something that is experienced quite a bit, unfortunately, and that can be violence from caregivers, and that can also be that people are targeted for violent crimes. Yes, William, turnover has increased significantly since the pandemic, which does lead to a greater risk potentially of abuse and neglect. Sometimes we've seen individuals who are given community access and they're excellent in the community, but they might actually end up being financially exploited or targeted for crimes in their community because their disability is one that is a bit more obvious or a bit more overt. And physical violence from caregivers, we see it. I think people who have physical needs that are a bit more intense are probably more likely to experience physical abuse because they do require greater levels of care. But certainly any of our individuals could experience physical violence. We're working with a young woman right now who on camera, a staff member was caught hitting her. And I'll save some of the story for later, but that physical abuse was certainly significant in her life. Doesn't matter how many times the staff hit her. It doesn't matter whether or not it was hard for her. It was trauma and significant trauma at that. And Danielle, yes, traumatic events can lead to so many secondary adversaries or adversarial situations that can cause stress in a person's life. You're absolutely right. Another type of trauma that we typically see, or not necessarily typically, but maybe are more likely to see, is emotional abuse. Many of the individuals we work with are aware that they are maybe a little bit different and they're not, neurotypical. And so they might have rejection or bullying from others because they're not necessarily the same as the rest of us in that respect. And then mistreatment from caretakers as well. I fully believe that every single individual that we work with is incredible, is very capable, is very intelligent, but sometimes it can be hard to see it, especially if that person is difficult too. And when I think about trauma, I also try and think about the trauma that our staff might have experienced. Let's just kind of put that in our heads. We'll talk about that a bit more later. But sometimes our staff will experience trauma after working with an individual as well. And that can impact how then they treat that person. And it can be sort of a circle that isn't ideal. And then sexual abuse. A lot of the examples we'll talk about today relate to sexual abuse. It's really, yes. Anybody who is commenting, please go ahead and make sure that your comments on the drop-down box are to everyone, not just the hosts and panelists, please. Sexual abuse, it can be assault from caretakers, from transport workers, from peers, from family. The vast majority of individuals that I have worked with who've had sexual abuse, it is family centered. But I have seen some instances where it was staff, and sexual abuse is is really, really common within our population. It's anywhere from 40 to 70% of people. And part of the reason that there's such a high level of variability in the percentages there is because so many of our individuals don't have the verbal skill set to express what it is that happened to them. It can be hard to discern, was this abuse? Is this just behavior? It's really hard. But we've seen that happen, frankly, far more frequently than we are in fact okay with. Once is too many, but it happens a lot more than that. So what are the effects of trauma? What does this actually mean for people? It changes how people behave. Anyone who has gone through a traumatic experience, you change what you're doing, you change how you're behaving. People will typically have some sort of a persistent fear response. So they might be a little bit overgeneralized within their trigger. So let's say that you know that your trigger is a tornado siren, for example. Anytime maybe there is a loud noise, if it is a fire alarm, if you live somewhere where there's frequent earthquakes, or just loud noise in general, maybe any loud noise becomes a trigger for you. So that becomes a difficult situation. In fact, this is a great segue for me. I worked with a young woman for many, many years. I adore her. And she had a very severe fear of tornadoes. And that was because she lived in an area where one went through and it threatened her life and her family's home. And it was really traumatic for her, obviously. And so it got to the point where she was incredibly fearful of loud noises. And in particular, the tornado sirens were just really difficult for her. And anytime she would get into a situation that was too loud, she would become very overstimulated and she would become physically aggressive. And so we had to work on, okay, how do we work with this young lady? And I'll get to some specifics in talking about how to deal with triggers and relating to her. But we were able to find some things that worked for her that really made it much better and gave her some independent skills. But it was one of those scenarios where initially it was just the tornado sirens that were really scary. And then it sort of shifted because we weren't quite sure what was going on. And we didn't intervene as quickly as we would have all liked to, that any loud noise became a bit of a trigger for her. And like I said, her go-to at that moment was physical aggression, which obviously no one wants to be physically assaulted. That's not why we're in this job. People who have had trauma might be engaged in hyperarousal, which is an extreme sensitivity to any kind of cues, any kind of touch, eye contact, and that those people are more likely to misinterpret those cues. A young woman I worked with a very significant history of sexual assault. She was someone who could not really spend much time around men at all. She was so uncomfortable with anyone who was a man. If a man looked at her, in her mind, that meant they were going to rape her. If someone touched her without her explicitly giving consent, that was a huge explosion verbally for her. And eventually for her, if no one could calm her, it would lead to self-abuse and attempts at suicide. And then people who have trauma, their brain actually physically changes. It's really interesting. There's an incredible book, and it's called The Body Keeps the Score. It is all about trauma. It's truly incredible. It's a great read. It's chewy, but I strongly recommend it because it really helps you get a better idea of how your brain changes with trauma and how that can lead to the development of a number of different concerns, typically depression and anxiety. Because if you are living in this state where you are constantly in fear or hyper aroused, it's just too much for your body to take. You need to be able to shut down and relax, and you can't when you're in those states. People also might have diminished executive functioning. Executive functioning really is sort of that part of you that is able to plan out what you're going to do. So when you get ready in the morning, you can plan out everything that you need to get accomplished to even get to the car okay. When you are dealing with trauma, you're not going to have the same level of executive functioning. And I think it's not unfair at all to say that we have all probably experienced trauma within the last 18 months or so related to COVID. And so there might be days where you find yourself doing things completely out of order and not even realizing it, or maybe leaving your house and still having slippers on, or two different shoes, and you're someone who's always very, very carefully dressed, or forgetting where you're supposed to be going, even though you've got your calendar in front of you. So all of those things relate to executive functioning, including academic achievement that could suffer, a decline in IQ, an inability to maintain attention like you have before. And then also delayed developmental milestones can certainly be a part of trauma. A lack of stimulation due to neglect can lead to those weakened neural pathways. I talked earlier about working in the school system, and I worked with a family in particular. Their two little ones, their two youngest ones, their heads were misshapen because they had stayed in car seats until the age of 3, because it was just easier for mom and dad to keep them in the car seats in front of the TV. And so we worked to sort of figure out the best ways to help those kiddos to get them exposed, but then also tried to get the family to get them to a neurologist to just ensure that there weren't long-term concerns over the development of their head shape. It can also mean that you're less responsive to reinforcement, particularly positive reinforcement. You might not have that same intense response that most of us do when something that's a reward is delivered. I see this especially in individuals who have been through sexual abuse, because if you look at that grooming process and how people get to the point where they are sexually abused, if it's a grooming situation, typically you'll start with compliments, presence, and things along those lines. So when people give you compliments or try and give you something and they don't have an agenda, your history though has been that person has an agenda ultimately to harm you. So your response is not going to be as intense or typical because of your learning history. And people who have been through trauma might misread those social cues. They might be defensive, they might be aggressive. Again, if they've been groomed, those things don't lead to anywhere that's good. So you're going to misread them and they react differently than a typical person would. So trauma-informed care, we talked about this a little bit, but it's just a set of principles. It is not at all prescriptive. It is not at all a simple situation. But we need to understand what someone has been through and what our goal is when we're trying to treat people with trauma-informed care, is we are always looking at how do we keep this person comfortable and safe. Oh, I'll have to look at that book. Thank you, William, or that. Yeah, I really want to check that out. That's interesting. I'm going to have to write that down. But our goal with trauma-informed care is for people, thank you, it's for them to be comfortable and safe. Because if they are not comfortable and safe, you cannot make progress with them. You cannot get them to a place where they're going to learn new skills or grow in what they have to offer. If we're not feeling safe, we are so focused on just survival, we can't get to that other part of our lives. We can't have enrichment in a better life. And trauma-informed care is found everywhere. Hopefully even more so now that we are trying to look at trauma-informed care, and we are working with hospitals, with residential agencies, certainly we within SST. We talk about trauma all the time. It is something that we harp on and make sure that we get the information about it. So critical to what we do. So what are the core steps? What are some of the things that we need to look at for trauma-informed care? The first one, and the one that I think is so important, is for us just to have an understanding or realizing the impact of trauma. And even if that takes you really taking a look back through your life and recognizing things that might have been traumatic for you and how they impacted how you behave, how you interact with others, and then think about what it is for someone else. I think that's really important. And then next, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma through evaluation and observation. I'm a behavior analyst by nature, so I love data. Data is something that I spend a lot of time analyzing and really picking apart to find out what in the heck is going on with someone. This is one of the areas where data can become just so critical, is we can look for trends within the data. Say, for example, you've got an individual who only engages in physical aggression with one staff person, sort of parceling out what is it within that relationship that is the problem. And let's say the staff is an excellent staff. They never deviate from the plan. They're like that perfect staff you could clone. Is there something in the trauma of that individual that we need to know? I had one person who was just excellent with all of her staff. She was great. But with one staff person, she wouldn't come near her. If that woman came too close to her, she would become verbally aggressive. And we were able to talk to that young woman and find out that staff person wore perfume that reminded her of someone who physically assaulted her in her lifetime. And so we worked with that staff person to not wear that same perfume, and that relationship changed immediately. That smell was a trigger for that young woman, and it was a pretty intense one. And that was great. That was a relatively easy fix, I'll be honest. We had to talk to the staff a couple of times about the importance of it because she'd never even considered it. And she was really attached to that perfume. It was important to her. But it was one of those where if you're going to continue to work in this home, we've got to figure out a solution here. We were lucky, Diane, we were really lucky. That young woman could tell us that. But if you have someone that can't tell you those things, it's a little bit harder sometimes. So then next, we want to respond by using what we already know about that person and what their trauma situation is when we plan for them. When we plan for what it is that we're going to work on with them. So if it is someone, like I said, the gentleman in the bathroom, right, that he doesn't want staff to go in the bathroom, we need to figure out a way to keep him safe in the bathroom, to get him to a state where he is cleaning himself appropriately, but also keep staff safe because he would be physically aggressive. So you don't want to necessarily put a plan in place for him where staff are going to hand over hand help bathe him, because that's just going to lead to everybody getting hurt, which is not only traumatic for that gentleman, but also for that staff. So we have to integrate all of those things in what we plan. And then we have to do everything that we can to try and keep us from not re-traumatizing that person. We need to try and create a safe and low stress environment. And I'm going to talk about triggers a lot and how do we handle them when they inevitably occur, because we can't necessarily get rid of all the triggers. So we have to be aware of that. Oh, Michelle, that's an interesting one. Yeah. She knew someone, was a young woman who was triggered when a picture was taken or when she was being video recorded because her sexual abuse included picture or video taking. That's really good to know about someone's history. If we can get that information, it can make all the difference in the world. So why trauma-informed care? I mean, I'm hoping that everyone here is on board for trauma-informed care, that I don't have to sell you on it. But let's talk about this anyway, just in case. It's a philosophy. It's not a procedure. And I think it's just a philosophy of kindness, basic human decency at this point, which is something that we definitely need more of in this world. But really, it's about making sure that we are considerate of others and what their experiences might have been and how it impacts them, how we can help them live a better, more full life that is enjoyable. It's also an evolution of just the world and the system of developmental disabilities changing so much in what the last 50, 60 years, right? The idea of institutions not being the norm, of people with disabilities living in the community, in group homes that are far more typical than an institution setting, and knowing full well that if you look at the history of institutions, there are rampant stories, unfortunately, of abuse, of exploitation, of neglect, that we are trying to move away from that within our history. And trauma-informed care can make a tremendous difference in how we treat people and how we're able to help them and give them a good life. Trauma-informed care goes along with ABA, which is applied behavior analysis, which is certainly something that I'm a proponent of as a BCBA. But even within our own history, there are things that have been done within our history that are not okay. And I think this trauma-informed care mindset has really grown from us doing a better job of being introspective about our own history, as well as listening so much more to people who are on the autism spectrum, to autistic people, so that we can have a better understanding of what it is in the practices that we have had in the past that aren't okay. For example, things like enforcing eye contact or not wanting people to engage in stimulatory behavior, stimming, hand flapping and things like that, that those are just simply not things that should have been focused on, because would it really matter? And some of the experiences of individuals were pretty traumatic related to that. So looking at all of our histories within all of our professions and saying, we've messed up, we've got to make changes in some areas and really be aware of what our actions do to others so that we can help them live a better life. So let's talk about setting events a little bit. And this is going to get into jargon a little bit, but I'm really not going to talk about it a ton because I don't want us to get into weeds with that. But one of the big changes that we've seen within our field in general is the idea, and sometimes this is still sort of earth-shattering with some agencies, the individuals that we work with are in fact completely capable of having emotions and physical sensations and have just a full sensory experience like the rest of us. So back in the day when ABA started, little history lesson, really all we ever did was look at just pure and simple behavior, what's in front of you. If I can't see it, it doesn't exist. Well, pretty quickly that got phased out because of course that's not real. Everyone has emotions. Everyone has internal experiences that just because I can't see them doesn't mean they don't exist. Because if that were the case, if those internal things didn't exist, feelings wouldn't exist. Physical sensations wouldn't exist because I can't see those things in someone else. So setting events and motivating operations, those are the things that are happening sort of internally to people that we'll never be able to see, that we'll never be able to fully understand, but they of course impact behavior because they impact how people are feeling. A simple example of this is each one of us. If we are currently battling allergies, because here in Springfield, they're harvesting the corn. This is prime sinus infection season for me. I might start to have some difficulty with pressure in this ear, or it might radiate down to my jaw. So I might be experiencing some pain and discomfort. My behavior might be different because of those things. This isn't even trauma related, right? This is just life. Those things can impact my behavior. But just because nobody else can experience the pressure that I'm feeling or the pain doesn't mean you're not there. So we have to be aware of what is going on internally with others, because those motivating operations, those private events, those do impact everything that we do. They impact our emotional state, our ability to regulate ourselves. That's just normal. Talk to anyone who's been sick and they'll tell you they're not necessarily their best selves. Talk to someone who hasn't gotten a full night's sleep. We're not our best selves. And frankly, none of us are 100% okay right now. None of us are as good as we should be. So these things have a tremendous impact on how we are behaving, on how we're handling things. So even with those little examples, right, those small things, they impact your behavior. So imagine those bigger things that are trauma related that people might be experiencing, how that might actually impact them just that much more. And how that might impact behavior that much more. And again, because it's internal, and a lot of the individuals we work with don't have really robust verbal skills, we don't know what it is that they are experiencing or they are feeling because we will never be in their bodies. So we have to think about those things and really take some time to be aware of them. And these are just a basic overview of this stuff. Like I said, I don't really want to get into the weeds on it. Let's talk just a little bit more about it. So we've talked a little bit already about triggers. And when it comes to motivating operations, when we look at triggers, it's really important because the trauma that people have experienced is associated with a trigger, something within the environment, right? Whatever it might be. A sensation, a taste, a smell, touch, any of those things can be a trigger for that person's trauma. So it's really important for us to understand what those triggers are so that we can help people work through them. If we experience those triggers, it might bring back that trauma. And then we all will get into that state of hyperarousal, of low resiliency, of not feeling safe, feeling very vulnerable, and our behavior inevitably will change. Speaking from my own personal experience, I work with a really great kid. He was having a rough night one night and he ended up biting me and he bit me in the face. And I honestly, for a second, thought I was going to lose my nose. He's one of those people that for me, that was a traumatic experience. I had to get some stitches and I'm fine. It was many, many years ago. But I know that when I went back to work with him in the future, after I was healed and after, there was nothing that he could see that would be concerning for him, it was still hard for me to be around him. Just seeing him, just hearing his name made me a bit more aware of my surroundings, made me a bit more concerned about where is that person, because I wanted greater physical distance between that person and I than I had in the past. So that if he were to bite again, I would maybe have more time to get away. So we need to be aware of those triggers because it will impact people's behaviors. I'm typically pretty darn comfortable in our group homes, but with him, I was on edge. I was always a bit more aware of what might have to happen, how I might have to protect myself and everybody else. Triggers can also elicit the emotions, not just the physical stuff, but the emotions as well. And it can be really hard because if that emotion is something that is really intense for someone and they don't have the ability to express it, that can be hard. You might have someone who's crying inexplicably and you can't figure out why. It could be related to trauma. And trauma does create a state of deprivation, which essentially is that you go back to a very, very basic state where you are not concerned at all about the higher order things in your life. You are looking at just the very basic things: food, shelter, safety, water, done. The rest of it, you don't have time for. You're just trying to survive. You might see people that over time engage in some very extreme behaviors to get those needs met because maybe they tried less intense behaviors and it just simply didn't work to get those needs met. And we'll talk about some of these situations. So what are triggers? Pretty much anything could potentially be a trigger, which is why it's so critical for us to know someone's history and to be aware of what their experiences were in the past so that we can understand what they are and maybe try and work on them. But exposure to triggers could elicit some pretty significant reactions from all of us. And typically what we will see is when someone is exposed to a trigger, they will engage in one of three different basic ideas. They may go to fight, which is where they are aggressive. They might yell, engage in property destruction. Flight, which is when someone might elope or self-stim and just want to get the heck out of wherever they're at. Or freeze. They might become disengaged, disassociate. I've even seen people sort of fall to the floor and sort of cradle themselves almost into a fetal position. And it's funny, one of my staff people, and I don't think she's in this one, it's usually fun when she's here, but she and her family adore haunted houses and they will go to haunted houses together. And it's funny because she and her sister and her brother to situations that scared them all have three radically different reactions. And they are the perfect trio to talk about these specific reactions because they all three fit into one of those three categories. And if I'm remembering correctly, she's the fighter. She's the person who will go ahead and start yelling back at the people who are in the haunted house and try and get them away and yell at them. And then her sister, I want to say, is the one that will literally just run through the house as quickly as possible to get the heck out of there. She is not going to defend you. She is going to save herself. She's gone. You'll see her at the end. And then her brother is someone who will actually sort of try and make himself small and sort of fit into the corner so that nobody sees him, so that that's how he can feel safe. But you might find yourself in one of these three situations. I am definitely a flight person. If it's a bad situation, if it's confrontational, it doesn't work for me or brings me back to trauma, I'm out. See ya. I'm not interested. That is not going to work for me to hang out and fight. It just is not who I am at all. So examples of this, people who have experience of neglect might overreact when they're told no, right? If they're told no, particularly to something that is sort of a basic need. So let's say they want more to eat and they're told no, they might have a really big reaction because maybe their history was that they never had enough food to eat. I can understand that. It's a good time to talk about a woman that I worked with. She was a really unique young lady. I adored working with her. It's been years since I've seen her, but she had a really significant history of sexual abuse within institution settings. And she was working in a particular workshop and her staff had called us in because at the home, no problems whatsoever. She was great. Everyone adored her. But at workshop, they were having a lot of trouble with physical aggression. And no one was quite sure why. They couldn't figure it out. So they called us in. And as we were reading through her history, there was just a real quick little note in one of the pieces of documentation that had sort of indicated that she had a history of sexual abuse. And some details of the event were shared and trigger warning for people who've experienced sexual abuse. She was someone who had repeatedly been raped by multiple assailants, and they had grabbed her from either behind or by the side and held her down. And so when we went back and looked through her incident reports, it was clear every single time she was physically aggressive towards staff or other clients was when someone approached her from the side or behind and touched her without talking to her first, without getting her attention first. And it could be something as simple as a staff person touching the side of her arm and saying, hey, I'm going to go past you. That might elicit physical aggression on her part. And so as soon as we put this all together, we thought, oh my gosh, maybe that's all this is, right? Maybe we need to work on the staff and the other individuals that their job is to always approach her from facing her and to get her attention first and to never touch her without her consent. Because given that history, I can't blame her anytime someone touched her for her to not immediately want to defend herself. We had some trouble convincing her day training staff, unfortunately. They really thought I was full of it. And real quickly, we were able to work as a team within her residential provider, her ISC and her guardian, everybody else who was just incredible for her team to find a different day training facility for her. And I was able to do, I don't know, it was a half hour, 45-minute training. It wasn't even intense with the new day training staff. And I relayed all this information to them. And immediately their response let me know she was going to be okay. They were horrified with what she had been through, and their reactions were extremely clear that they were going to be respectful of that. In fact, they started to rearrange the rooms where she would be in that day training center so that her back and her sides would always be up against a wall so that no one could approach her from that particular set of directions. They also worked out a system where if anyone went to go talk to her, they would ensure they had her eye contact first and that she had said hello or responded to them in some way, shape, or form. And there was always a very clear direction that before you touched her, you must have her explicit consent. You must tell her exactly how you will be touching her, where you will be touching her, and why, so that she never had to question it. And she went to this new day training site, and we were able to close the case rather quickly because everyone followed through and they respected that for her, this was a really big deal. And I haven't worked there in a couple of years, but it was amazing because she didn't have any trouble. Everybody just really did what they should do. It was amazing to see people really understand her trauma. And even though they hadn't been through it themselves, to have that respect for her and to not do those things to her. In fact, I know there's at least one person from that agency and that DT on here right now. And I hope she's still doing well. She was a sweetheart. I really, really enjoyed her. She was very, very sassy. It was lovely. I like a sassy person. And so her reaction to being exposed to those triggers was to fight. She was ready to throw down, and she might have been a small, like sort of diminutive, little older lady. She could kick some butt if she had to. She most definitely was quite capable. So we have to be aware that people are going to have these potential reactions and know how to handle them. And so it's our job to start working on identifying these triggers, looking at people's data, looking at their information to say, okay, what on earth could it be that actually triggers this person to get to that point of that response? Because we have to look at them and say, okay, what do we do about them? They exist. We're not going to maybe be able to get rid of those triggers, but how do we help this person? A person might not even react immediately to the trigger in a way that is obvious. Maybe there's someone who internally sort of freezes and then later they'll start to ask questions or have behaviors. But we really need to analyze those precursor behaviors and those triggers in the environment and the signals, the things that that individual does that lets you know they might not be okay. And when we know triggers, we can really work with that person and understand. A trigger for one woman that I worked with years ago was just men in general. She had, again, a very rampant history of sexual abuse within her family. And it was pretty clear that if there was a man working in her home, it was not going to go well if they interacted with her. They could even just look at her, make eye contact with her, and it was tough for her. And she ended up moving out to a really unique situation where She almost had her own apartment, but it was a building of apartments, and there were a number of individuals that each had their own physical space. And she had some other really unique behaviors, and we were called in to work with her on physical aggression and verbal aggression and self-injury, all sorts of things. And the first time we met her, because no one had sort of prepped us for this, we noticed that she was wearing multiple layers of clothing, and that her personal hygiene habits left a bit to be desired. She was someone who had an odor about her. And when we started talking to some of her direct care staff in particular, they expressed frustrations because her particular apartment didn't smell good. She didn't smell good. The staff would leave her apartment and they would smell and not be happy about it. Her behaviors of the verbal, physical aggression and self-abuse were really difficult for the staff to mitigate. And because she chose to wear basically every item of clothing that she owned at all times, it was a bit of a battle to do laundry. And doing laundry was quite important, again, due to her own hygiene habits. And she was a very skilled young woman. She was extremely high functioning. She had great verbal skills. She was someone who could live fairly independently. And so we had to dive into her information and understand what was going on here. We weren't sure if it was some sort of like a personality disorder or what it was. Well, then when we started looking through her history and started working with her more and established rapport with her, she was willing and able to talk to us a bit about her history. And it became clear that she was someone who, when she put those multiple layers of clothing on, it was literal armor for her. Having more layers of clothing on meant that people couldn't undress her quickly, that they couldn't assault her. So her layers of clothing made it harder for people to harm her. And that's why she chose to wear, so many items. And when she was feeling safer, she would wear less clothing. And also being less careful with their personal hygiene was another way to protect herself. Again, people who are not, who don't smell as good might not be as likely to be victims of sexual assault. So we had to then work with her staff. We identified that men were just not a great safe option for her. She didn't feel safe around men in general. So we were able to restaff things, that she was working exclusively with women. And then we worked on educating her staff. Most of them didn't have any idea what her trauma history was at all. They didn't understand any of why she was doing what she was doing. And she didn't feel safe to tell them, especially because there were so many caretakers in and out of her house on a regular basis. She didn't know who was coming next. And so she felt like she always needed to have that protective armor of all that clothing on, because if it was someone who she didn't feel safe with, she was already ready to go. She was as safe as she could be. So we started working on different visuals for her to let her know who was going to be coming next or who was scheduled. And if that schedule had to change, that her staff would call her and let her know. And we started talking about ways to make her feel safer in her own home. So there were different locks put on doors and alarms put on doors and windows so that no one could get into her physical space without her being alerted. We worked on putting, I think we were able in the end to either move her into a different room or move like the washing machine to her room so that she could wash her clothing in a space where she still felt very safe. And then we started working on the hygiene too. And with therapy and medication and a lot of really great supports, we got to the point where she was wearing a lot less clothing. A lot of days she would wear maybe only half of her clothes, so that one day she'd wear half of them, the next day she would have the other half on, and they could launder every other day. And we worked on a lot of things with our agency, and it worked pretty darn well. I mean, she was never going to be someone who didn't have some level of triggers, especially males. You can't get rid of every male in the world. That's just not realistic. But we were able to work with her so that she could feel safer. Her hygiene improved, her self-worth improved. I mean, she was someone who, if you didn't get to her right away, when she was escalated, it would go straight to self-harm and suicide attempts. So it was really important for us to understand those triggers. There were certain days of the week that were really hard for her, certain anniversaries of dates that were really hard. So it was important for in her history for that to be clearly stated over and over and over again, and then proactively work with her on those things so that she knew how to feel safe, to talk about those things openly, that it was okay to have these feelings and these fears about other people. And so if we can identify triggers, we might be able to remove them Some are ones that we can remove. And if not, maybe we can minimize them, hopefully create a safer and more positive environment for that individual. Oh, Maria, thank you. That's really, really sweet. So why is it important? Why are triggers important? Well, those exposures to triggers, right? Those really create this significant emotional state for us. I mean, think about your own trauma and triggers that are hard for you. Like I said, if someone were to name that young man who I worked with years ago, and it's been, actually we're coming up on 9 years, the anniversary of it, 9 years. If I were to hear his name, I would be a little bit heightened in my response. Would it be nearly as intense as it was all those years ago? No, not at all. But I would still be cautious. I would still be aware of where he is. How could I get away if he started to become aggressive? You know, my response would be different. So if we know what people's triggers are, we can help them deal with them. We can help them when they have to face these things that inevitably will happen in the world. It's also really important because knowing someone's triggers and working through them can help establish and sort of build back up a therapeutic relationship with staff. Because if a staff person exposes you to a trigger, even unintentionally, you are not as likely to have a good relationship with that person. You can do skill training with people to increase engagement. And I've got a good example, actually a pretty good example of a young woman who, the young lady I talked about earlier with the pretty significant fear of tornadoes. She got to the point where, like I said, all loud noises were really hard for her. And she would go for physical aggression. And it was really, 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 really hard for her. And I'll be honest, I adore her. She's wonderful. So she holds a bit of a special place in my heart. But we figured out that it was the tornado sirens and loud noises. And so we had to work on, okay, she lives in central Illinois. Tornado sirens are going to be a part of her life. Her family is from this area. She's not going to move to someplace where there aren't tornadoes. So we're going to have to figure out how to help this be easier for her. Because at least once a month, right? First Tuesday of the month here at 10 a.m., they test them. So at least once a month, she's going to be exposed specifically to a tornado siren. And so we were able to work with her to figure out that it was the loud noise part that was really, really tough for her. So we got her some headphones, and they ended up being called her magic ears. She had some social stories around her magic ears, and we were able to get to the point where over years of work, where she could request them at any time and staff would always have them, or she would have a backpack with her magic ears. And if things got too noisy, she could just pop them on and everything was great. And when we were training on how to work on all of this, because we knew, again, the predictability of those tornado sirens was a big deal. So we would make sure that approximately 5 to 10 minutes before they would go off, we would read through the social story with her. We would talk about what the siren was, and then it was just a test. And then we would figure out what support did she need to feel safe during those times. And so her magic ears were part of it. And they were also purple, just some purple noise canceling headphones that she adored. And then there were times where she was extra afraid for whatever reason. And so we would try and move her, and she was very compliant with this, especially if we got to her before the siren went off, and that was pretty critical for her. If she was still feeling really unsure that day, and she had some verbal skills to be able to tell us that, we would actually move her to a room in the home that was where you would normally go if there were a tornado. So a bathroom or an interior room without major windows or mirrors or anything like that. And she could sit in there, and we would let her sit in there. Initially, it was kind of open-ended how long she was in there. It was until she felt calm, and then she could come out and then gradually take off her ears and sort of reintegrate into the room. And then we put some time limits into place where it was like, okay, the sirens go off at 10 a.m. By 10:10, it's done. You're back out in the community or the room that we're in. And it worked so well with her. She is someone who now, yes, is aware that those sirens are going to go off. There's going to be loud noises, but she can proactively on her own, the minute she starts to feel a little bit agitated and recognize those physical symptoms in her own body, to go ahead and just pop her ears on. And it's great. If the noise goes away, staff can ask her to take them off. If she's comfortable doing that, she'll do it in a heartbeat. If she's not, she'll tell staff quite clearly. And everyone's like, okay, great. It made a tremendous impact in her life. She's now able to carry out jobs within the community and do all sorts of really wonderful independent skills but those triggers were never going to be able to go away entirely. And that's the reality with most triggers related to trauma, is they are always going to exist, but we have to figure out how do we help that person deal with them. And she was someone who, like I said, didn't have the greatest verbal skills. She's got some, but not a ton. And her go-to was physical aggression. She was a larger person. She was someone whose physical stature could definitely be used to her advantage. So what does this all mean? All this trauma-informed care stuff. Really, what we need to do, what this really comes down to, is we have to assess for trauma and then create a safe environment for people. And when I say assess for trauma, I know that there are different tools out there that can be used. I don't have any specific recommendation. I would assume that most of you have some level of a risk assessment if you're working within a residential agency or a DT agency, where you can kind of go through things. I know that when we get new cases through SST, we always ask, what is that person's trauma history? And we've gotten to the point where we can't even just ask that, because sometimes people's understanding of trauma isn't the same as ours. And so we will specifically ask, has this person ever been sexually abused or physically abused? Have they ever been within the foster care system or in institutions? Sort of trying to get to the meat and potatoes of what their life has been like, so that we can be aware of what things might be impacting their behavior. Because we have to create a safe environment so that person can hopefully de-escalate internally, to get to the point where they can talk to us about what's going on and show us what will help them feel better. So other treatment principles related to trauma-informed care. It's important that from the top down of every agency, that people are understanding of trauma, that they are willing to talk about it, that they are willing to try and create an environment that is supportive around understanding trauma. You have to recognize those symptoms and try and figure out ways to adapt that person's environment to make it safer for them. View trauma in context of that person's environment. I talked about her way earlier, but we're working with a young woman right now who was hit by one of her staff members. And as we've started to get a little bit more information, it's become clear that she was hit. It's on video. But unfortunately, the response of one of her administrators within her agency was, well, it wasn't that bad, or it wasn't that big of a deal. And it's really unfortunate, because whether or not we think it's a big deal, it is a big deal to her. So if we think something isn't traumatic, we need to be careful to really, really be aware that what our version of trauma is may not be the same as someone else's. So just because we look at something and think, wow, that wouldn't affect me that way, doesn't mean it isn't traumatic for someone else. So we need to be aware of that. Another thing that we're seeing with that particular young lady is one of the staff who at least witnessed several abusive situations within the past year or so of her life still works with her consistently. And so that's kind of hard too, because that staff may be an excellent staff person, but they might actually be re-triggering her unintentionally. Just their mere presence might be difficult. So that's something for us to all be aware of too. And yes, Terry, you're right. Or excuse me, not Tara, Terry. Trauma is completely different for every single person. You could have 20 people be in the same situation at the same time, and their perception of that situation and the trauma around it could be completely different. So it is really important to be aware of what that person's perception and feelings of that trauma are. That's what we need to work on. It's not that everybody has to have the same perception. That's not a good use of our time. It's working on what that person's feelings are and then helping them. We have to do our best to minimize the risk of re-traumatization and create a safe environment, whatever it looks like for that person. And recovery from the trauma or mitigation of the effects of trauma, that is our goal. We may never be able to be done with that trauma. It may still always be there to some extent, but we want to try and get people to the point where maybe they don't have to go back to the most intense version of what that trauma was like for them. We want to support people having choice, control, and autonomy in their lives. The woman I spoke about earlier with the magic ears, she had such a better quality of life when she just had those couple of things put in place for her. Whereas before, she was someone that people had a hard time working with. She was traumatic for staff because of her physical aggression, because of how she reacted to her own trauma. And so giving her all of those tools not only made her more fun for staff to work with, because then she was lovely. Her biggest issue after that was she would yell now and then because she would get really excited about things. And then she wasn't traumatized either. So her quality of life along with staff's got so much better. And then we want to create those collaborative relationships as well. That's huge. Other treatment principles, we want to familiarize our clients with trauma-informed services, letting people know who are some safe people to talk to if they're having a rough day or a rough time. Tracy, who I said hello to earlier, unless your role has significantly changed, I know you do a lot of counseling and assistance at your agency. That's huge. People know you're there. If they know who they can talk to, who is a safe person that they can be vulnerable with, that can make all the difference in the world. You can help them process through some of it. And by you allowing them to talk to you, if you're that person for someone who's been traumatized, you might be able to get some information about their triggers and what will help them react better in the future. That can help everyone. I think it's really critical that everyone goes ahead and does routine trauma screenings with the individuals that they are serving, so that they are aware what that person's history is, and always be willing to dig a little deeper. And along with that, I think it's really critical, and I've already said this, but I'll say it again because I think it's so important. If you know of someone's history and there's trauma in it, find a way to document it in your documents. Always sort of live by the idea that maybe everything else in that person's life will go away, right? That the documents will be lost, they'll get burned down, whatever it is. If your one document is the one thing that's surviving, your willingness to write about that person's trauma and what works for them could make all the difference for them long-term. And if it's really successful strategies, we need to make sure that documentation always follows that person. We also want to use a strengths-focused perspective to promote resilience. So if we know that someone has really good skills in a particular area, try and use those skills to their advantage, right? The young lady with the headphones, oh my gosh, she was a social store champion. She just loved them. They worked for her. She would grab them and read through them herself on a regular basis. They really worked for her. So that's what we used. I've had other people who don't react to social stories at all. Okay, so we use something different for them, right? I worked with a little boy years and years and years ago, and I'm not always sure that this was trauma for him as much as it was echolalia, but he would ask incessant questions. Incessant. I mean, from the minute he woke up to the minute he went to bed, it was question after question after question. And when he was done wanting to discuss whatever it was you were discussing, his last three questions were always, is it dangerous? Could it hurt me? Will I die? And I have to wonder sometimes if there was some trauma there, because I was never able to get a good handle. I only worked with him for a short period of time on what his family life was like. I know that his mother was very involved in his life. He lived with her, but I could never get a good idea of what happened to his father or where his father was. And it sort of made me wonder if there was some trauma there with his father, if his father had passed away, or if there had been some traumatic event there, because it always went back to those three questions. Funny enough, I see him on a regular basis now. He's much older than he was then, and I haven't heard him do any continuous questioning. So maybe it wasn't trauma related, but it was important for me to try and dig in that, and I couldn't long-term, unfortunately. But just to have that understanding of what is it that's going on with that person? Why are they asking me those questions? What could that mean? And then it's important too that we show an organizational and administrative commitment to trauma-informed care. It has to go from the top down. And if it doesn't, you're not going to get very far, because you could have some incredible DSPs who are super trauma-informed, right? Who are able to understand people on a level that is just unparalleled. But if they don't get the support from their higher ups, it's not going to help anything. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a group home and worked with a direct care person who knows their people, right? Who knows the individuals living in that home, and they can give me the most insightful information that nobody else knows. We have to rely on everyone top down to be able to understand those things and work through them. We have to develop strategies to address secondary trauma and promote self-care. If we can teach people coping skills that they can use on their own, that they can engage in whenever, wherever that trauma might start to come back up, that's incredible. We all use soothing skills and coping skills throughout the day for ourselves. We need to teach that to the people that we're working with. And then also provide hope. Where someone is at with their trauma today doesn't mean that's where they're going to be forever. Things can get better. So creating a safe environment is so important. And it's not just about people being safe from attack or abuse, because that's just not good enough. We need to do more than that. It needs to be a place where they can truly relax. And I look at this a lot from the lens of being a residential provider, right? The people who are living in the group homes, that is their house. Think about when you go home, what it feels like, what you're able to do to distress from your day, to feel calm, to feel safe. What is it that you do that helps you? Is it that you are immediately someone who changes from your work clothes into your pajamas? Do you have pets and you go take them for a walk or engage with them? Do you call your loved ones? Do you talk to your loved ones who live with you? What is it that you do that helps you feel safe? And then what is it that we can replicate in these group homes? Because it is their house, it is their home. Every single person we work with should be able to feel that safe in their home. They should also get it in their DT, don't get me wrong, but their home especially, that is the place where we should be able to shed all of that other stuff and just be our most true version of ourselves. The place where you should be able to relax and be calm. So we do really have to be aware of all of that and see what we can do that can help that person. If it is someone who has experienced sexual abuse in the bathroom, right? What can we do within the bathroom of the group home they live in so that it doesn't re-trigger those experiences as much? Maybe they can tell us, oh, this is the same color on the wall that my bathroom was. Time to repaint. Maybe let them pick out a different color that they like, right? Painting is a pretty easy thing to get done compared to so many other things. We really want to work on improving someone's quality of life within that safe environment. That's why it's so important. Safe also means responsive. And this is a little bit hard to read, guys, I apologize. It's one that's adaptive to the needs of that person. We need to think about what can we do within that physical space to make them feel safer. And the visual here of someone who is utilizing a wheelchair for transport and for daily life, something as simple as ensuring that everything within that home, if it's someone who is using wheelchair assistance, that it's wheelchair friendly, that the hallways are nice and wide as they need to be, that there are bathroom facilities that meet their needs, that they can get in and out of the home without staff assistance, that maybe the transportation that we're utilizing, the vehicles for the home, are also ones that allow them to maintain their independence with their adaptive equipment, whatever it might be that works for that person. For an individual who is not hearing, right? Staff that knows some basic sign if that person uses sign, or that they have another method that allows them to communicate to get their needs met. So we need to set up the physical environment to be one that is great for that person. We also need to be aware of what those triggers are, that they are identified, that they are either eliminated or minimized, and that people are taught skills to avoid or cope with the triggering stimuli. And I think one thing that really isn't listed here explicitly, but should be, is that staff are provided training on a regular basis about individuals' trauma history, about what things are triggering for them and what their reaction might be, so that staff can have a better awareness. Certainly long before any staff person works with an individual, they should have all of that knowledge. People should be trained on it though, again and again and again, because it's easy to forget. And especially if someone's trauma history is one that you don't, or their trauma and their triggers are things you don't see typically, like on a regular basis, it's easy to forget because we all have a million other things that we are trying to work on. So we need to be aware of getting our staff trained. Safe also means consistency. And some of the questions that you can ask, that help create consistency for people is how do we get our residential staff to care more about the residents? And most of our staff are incredible, don't get me wrong. But if you're noticing that they're really struggling with an individual, that relationship might not be what you want it to be. So how do we shift that mind frame or that mindset from this person is really difficult to work with to this person is difficult because of this history, and here's what we can do differently to help them, because in the end, it makes our lives less difficult as well. And then how do we work with new staff, particularly people who are new to the field in general? So I feel like what I'm seeing now within hiring is that, we're often hiring people that may not have any experience in the field, so they don't quite understand everything that we do. So how do we teach them? How do we educate them from the moment they walk through the door their first day? How to create rapport, how to create really good relationships with the individuals that they are working with. And then how are we getting staff to be more engaged with the individuals that they work with? Because that engagement goes so far in building those therapeutic relationships. SAFE also means supporting staff. Well, what can we do to retain quality staff? Oh boy, David, that is the bajillion-dollar question these days. And I realize that there is probably no magic wand situation that I can offer to you today. And I apologize for that. I wish I really had the perfect situation. I think one of the things that I have always found to be really helpful is just trying to have relationships with your staff. Having rapport with staff, yourself, right? Whatever your role is within your agency is really important, because if you have a rapport with those staff people, they're more likely to tell you about the tough things that are going on, not only within their own lives, but within the group homes or the DT setting or wherever it is that you work, so that you can start to work on those things. I think one thing that I've always found to be huge is acknowledging the trauma that staff go through when they're working with difficult individuals. How coming to work, even though it's something that we have to do, some days can almost feel like a trigger, being traumatic within itself if you're working with people who are difficult. So I think that is a huge step within itself. I also feel like being vulnerable yourself and talking about your own experience that can be helpful. Just so, no man is an island, and then your willingness to open up might help other people be willing to open up too. And Terry, I think you're right too. It is a very different question now. COVID is very traumatic for all of us. And whether or not you've lost a loved one or an individual that you've worked with, it has impacted all of us greatly. Yeah, so I don't have a quick and easy answer to that, but I think there's little things we can do to help. I also think working on staff resiliency, actively talking about it, is a really, really important thing to do. And we actually do some trainings on resiliency and self-care and things like that, that I'm always willing to give. It's a topic I'm very passionate about. But it's really important for us to have those good relationships with our staff as well, so that we can help emulate the relationships we want them to have with individuals. That can be really critical as well. We want to have rapport, and good rapport is really, really important. And I think sometimes the difference between the good rapport and the bad rapport can be as simple as following the behavior plan or not. Sometimes what we see is people who don't have good rapport with individuals are offering them things like bribes or threats. And in the short term, those things may pay off and the behavior will stop. Long term, it can be very difficult for the staff to continue to work in that home, and for the individuals to work with those staff as well. So we really want to have good rapport, strong social support for everyone. Working with the staff, retraining them, providing them with supports. The agencies that I have seen be most successful long-term, pre-COVID and during COVID, and hopefully someday we'll all be able to say post-COVID, are ones where the administrators are going out to the homes, and not just for 5 minutes here and there, but really going in for a couple of hours and assisting staff, going in and helping do the actual work. It's easy for those of us who are not in a group home day in and day out to forget how hard it is to be a DSP. It's rough, right? There are a lot of things on their plate. They may have moments where they get to relax for a minute, but typically there's a lot of things that they're doing. And so going in and just providing assistance can make a big difference. One of the most successful homes that I did behavior work in for many, many years, the staff were great. They were super, super dedicated, but they expressed to me pretty quickly that there was already a behavior person working in the home, and they hadn't seen her in a couple of months. And so was I going to be just like her? Because she just always told them what to do, but didn't show up. And my reaction was no, I'm hoping to be very different. I'm hoping to be here every single Wednesday. I'm hoping to be here for years to help you guys out. And one of the things that I said to them the first day that I worked there, and I will repeat it day in and day out until I'm blue in the face, is I will never ask a staff person to do something I am unwilling to do myself. And the only things that I couldn't ever do for that agency were things like med passes, because I wasn't certified to do that work. But literally, if they were cooking dinner and they needed to pull something out of the oven because it was going to burn, I was there doing it. If someone needed some assistance with hygiene, I was there doing it. If it was laundry, done. It didn't matter what the letters were in front of or behind my name versus anybody else. Getting in there and doing the actual work and assisting can be all the difference in the world. Those staff were incredible. They would do anything I asked them to try. And if it didn't work, it was always an open and honest conversation about, here's exactly what we did. Here's why we think it didn't work. And we would figure out solutions to the problems. And I feel like that went a really long way to not only helping those young ladies that I worked with in that home, but also those staff. And I was really, really lucky that most of those staff stayed on for years. And even now, if I were to see them in the community, it would be an immediate reaction. We would hug each other and just really, we had a great relationship, and that helped a lot. Jennifer, I try. I fail on a regular basis, but sometimes I do it the right way. We all do, right? An emphasis on client history. It's so critical, so critical. Do the extra work, read all of the paperwork, hunt the paperwork down. Be that Sherlock Holmes that you need to be to find out what it is that happened to that person. And it can be hard. And there are definitely going to be scenarios where we are not going to get all the information, especially if it's someone who's been in the system in some way, shape, or form for a long time. That's going to be hard. A lot of the older individuals that I've been working with over the past 9 years, they might have been individuals who there wasn't really a whole lot of support in the system. They were people who went to institutions when they were quite young, because that was the option, right? It's not, they didn't have wonderful families or anything like that, but that was the option that was available to them. And so you might not have good paperwork from that time. So it's important to continue to ask people if they can find it, if you can get that information, and to read every bit of it. Don't just let it collect dust on your desk. Please read it. You might find a little piece of information that goes a long way to understanding who that person is and what their needs are. There's some times where we don't actually know what the abuse is. There's a lot of people that will never be able to get quite the full story. Families don't want to disclose it, or families don't know themselves, or all of those kind of things. It can happen. Experiences trauma is unknown, right? Maybe we just didn't understand what happened to them. I know several individuals who like to take like a backpack to work with them or in the community when they go with them, and it's got items to them that are really important. Maybe they were someone who lost things that were important to them in their lifetime. So maybe carrying that backpack, even if it's burdensome for that person or for staff to have to worry about all of it, maybe it's something for them that helps them feel more calm. And then also, unfortunately, very, very unfortunately, I've seen this many times where the family will not necessarily disclose information or maybe more transient in nature because they're trying to protect the abuser. This is particularly common in sexual abuse situations. And I've seen it happen far more often than I care to admit, where a family will not disclose the full information because that person's abuser is still a significant part of their life, whether or not that person wants them in their life. So we need to be aware of these things. If we don't know, we can't possibly help that person and be as trauma informed as we need to be. So when we are screening for trauma, there's definitely a lot of things that we need to be aware of, but here's just some of them. Trauma-related symptoms, which we talked about already. Depressive symptoms, because a lot of times people who have experienced trauma might also be dealing with depression and anxiety. Sleep disturbances, any sort of mental health diagnosis that person has had in the past, particularly, of course, trauma-related things. Type and characteristics of trauma, substance abuse. While that's not something that is particularly common within the population of individuals with developmental disabilities, I mean, all we have to do is look at many of the soldiers that we've seen come home from wars. Certainly, I mean, since World War I, when we talked about people being shell-shocked, now to really talking openly about, veterans who have been through combat and having PTSD. Substance abuse is rampant among that population because it's a way to sort of mitigate and deal with some of those triggers and the stressors that they're dealing with. So if you're dealing with someone who has a history of substance abuse, it could be trauma related. Social support, coping styles, and availability of resources. What is it that actually works for that person? And then also be aware of their risk for self-harm, suicide, and violence, and then health screenings in general. There are a number of different health screenings that should be done that can assess for potential sexual abuse. I mean, certainly rape kits can be done. And there was a young woman that SST worked with before I was on board. But the short version of her story, and this is why it's so important to talk about this, is we were working with her family and she was severely agoraphobic. She hadn't left her home in many, 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 many years. And in fact, had not even wanted to leave her room within her family home. We worked with the family. We were able to get her out of the home, get her to a couple of medical appointments, and found out that she had cancer. And it was very, very widespread. And she passed away not long after we found out that she had cancer. But the cancer that she had was from HPV. And it was because a family member of hers had been sexually assaulting her for years. And so we were able to tie it back to that trauma. And her family didn't know. They had no idea whatsoever that she had been sexually assaulted. But had she gotten a health screening maybe when she was younger, maybe all of that could have been avoided as far as her death when she was so young and the trauma of the cancer for her. And then, of course, for her family as well. So we need to do those health screenings. I'll be honest, anytime I'm working with someone who has had an active sex life or a sexual abuse history, I always ask if they've screened for STDs, STIs, specifically things like syphilis, because syphilis can eventually cause deterioration and insanity. So those are important things to look for. It's important also, I've talked about this just a tiny bit, but really training for caregivers. We have to teach our staff these things. If they don't know, they can't possibly respond appropriately. That training doesn't always have to be extensive. It doesn't always have to be really intense. The woman I talked about earlier, who just needed no one to approach her from the side or behind, I only had to train that staff once. And most of that training was actually problem solving to modify the environment to meet her needs. As soon as everybody else was able to see it and understand it, it was like, holy cow, this poor lady, like she deserves better. Let's do better for her. And it was wonderful to work with that staff. I'd be thrilled to work with them anytime because they just responded so well to her and took her needs into account. So we have to train staff. We have to tell them these things and then also provide staff with the feedback when they are doing the things we want them to do, as well as when they're not doing what we want them to do. It's so easy for us as human beings to only fault people for the things that they're not doing well. We need to provide the feedback when they are doing the right things too. That's another way maybe to retain staff, is to focus on the good, sort of change our shift. And I'm not saying it's easy, but we really have to try these days. We are running a little bit short on time, guys, because I'm a talker. So some of these things I'm going to go through relatively quickly so that we can try and hit everything, and then I can leave some time for questions as well. But we really want to focus on active listening, not just with us, but with our staff as well, and teach them these things to make sure that they are giving people eye contact, and that staff are aware in particular that someone not giving you eye contact isn't necessarily an issue. If you are in a vulnerable situation or setting and you are talking about things that are related to trauma, you are not as likely to make eye contact with others, because sharing eye contact is a pretty intimate thing that you're not going to do unless you're feeling safe. So if someone isn't making eye contact with you, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not listening. But staff need to be aware that they're probably going to give more eye contact to individuals than individuals to them, particularly when they're discussing trauma. We also need to be aware of how our body language impacts these sorts of things too. And I'm just going to go ahead and move through these slides. Yes, Rebecca, I didn't realize it wasn't emailed out to you guys. I will ensure that we get that out to you. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I will throw my email address in here again, guys, at the end. If you want to email me directly, please do. I'll send the slides and the information out to you happily, not a problem. Body language. We need to be aware of what our body language can convey, right? If we want to have a good relationship with others, we need to know how much physical distance we need to have between others. And this is not even like social distancing at this point, right? But if we are standing very close to someone, they might feel uncomfortable. And if we are standing too far, they might feel uncomfortable. So it's always nice to ask, are you comfortable with how far I am away, or can I move closer, or should I move farther away? That's really important for us to do. So we need to be sure that we are in fact keeping distance between ourselves and others. Typically, it's nice if you can have more than one arm's length. If it's someone who has a strong history of physical abuse or sexual abuse, you might want to even be farther away. And vocal qualities. This is really imperative too. The individuals that we serve sometimes don't have good verbal skills, but my goodness, can they interpret nonverbals like nobody's business, right? They can tell you right away if you're having a good day or a bad day and how you're feeling based on the way that you interact with them and you talk about them. So we have to be aware of our own reactions as well. So are we really loud? Are we too quiet? Are we someone that when we're anxious or experiencing trauma, maybe speak a little bit faster? Those are things that we need to be aware of. Our emotions certainly come out in our words. And then, be aware that people's vocal qualities might tell you how they're feeling as well. And then verbal tracking skills. Staying on topic is a huge thing. If you are able to stay on topic with that person and give them sort of that conversation, they know that you're understanding, or at least attempting to understand what it is that they are sharing with you. If they choose to change the topic, it could mean they're really uncomfortable with the conversation, that it's hitting a little too close to home, or they're not ready to talk about that. It's important for us to demonstrate that active listening so we can repeat key phrases to that person and sort of paraphrase what they've said to us in order to ensure that we have understood what they mean and what they're trying to convey. Open-ended and closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions are the ones where the answer is yes or no. Ideally, if we're trying to work on trauma with someone or understand their trauma, it's going to be best for us to use questions that cannot be answered easily in yes or no, ones that give them an opportunity to express themselves a little bit more. The reality is, if you ask someone yes and no questions, you can lead them to an answer that isn't necessarily accurate. So if you have the ability to work with someone and give them the opportunity to tell you more than just yes or no, it's definitely something that we should be working on. It also discourages discussion. It doesn't really open things up for more conversation. And typically, if someone's going to be working on trauma, they're not going to just blurt out everything that happened to them and share it all without establishing that rapport, and maybe even reestablishing that rapport each time they talk to you. Like if you're someone who's working in a more clinical role, you may get to the point eventually with someone where they sit down and talk with you and immediately they tell you everything. But you might have to sort of reestablish that rapport a little bit every time you meet with them. But we also want to be careful how many questions we ask, because too many questions can also discourage communication. So the truth is, we have to kind of find that sweet spot where we are asking the questions that help, not just asking questions to ask questions. We also have to be careful how we respond. We have to encourage not only with our verbal skills, but our nonverbals as well. We have to make sure that we are conveying that we are open to these conversations, that we are open to helping people. Our body language is so important. If someone walks into your office and you happen to have a grumpy expression on your face, your arms are crossed and your tone of voice is sort of gruff, people aren't as likely to have a conversation with you. People aren't as likely to disclose things to you. So if you happen to notice about yourself that you're not in a great headspace, or that your nonverbals are sort of conveying that you're not in a position to be able to talk to people, it's okay to talk about it. In fact, it's something we do in this office on a regular basis. If someone's having a rough day, we're pretty good about talking about it. Or if I reacted to someone and I didn't like how I reacted, maybe talking to them later, being like, you know what, I'm really sorry. I feel like I reacted this way to what you said, and it's not what I meant to convey. It's not what I meant to do. So I'm sorry. And did you feel like we had the chance to talk about that, or would you like to talk about it more? Those things can go an incredibly long way to helping people. Also, it's really good for us to paraphrase so that we fully know that we've understood what someone has said to us, because our interpretation of their words might not be accurate. We want to use the major words that that person used. Okay, so let's talk about validating. Validating is incredibly important with any kind of trauma work, whether it's with individuals, whether it's with staff, your own family, yourself, right? And validating goes a long way. Within validation, we are not assuming that you understand 100% what that person has gone through. You never will. It's just not a realistic thing. And with validation, you don't even have to agree with the person and what they're saying. But what you are trying to do is get some understanding of their feelings and let them know that their feelings, whether or not you agree, are valid, because we are all entitled to our feelings, whatever they might be. So you might have someone say something to you. And these are actually, some of these are more related to being a supervisor. This job sucks. I don't know anybody who probably hasn't said that about their job in the last year and a half, because these jobs right now are extra hard. And so maybe what you can say is, I hear you saying that this job sucks right now. It sounds like you're really frustrated. Is there anything I can help you with? Right? You don't have to agree, because maybe you're having a great day and you love your job, and that's fine. But you don't have to tell that person, well, you're wrong, this job is amazing, or it's better than the last job I had. That's not helpful. That's sort of, well, it's invalidating. So you want to validate the person. If one of the individuals that you're working with says something like, well, taking these meds make me feel crazy. Okay. What you can say then is, it sounds like you don't like the way your medications make you feel. Is that correct? And the person will say yes or no, or whatever they will say. And then maybe you can get an idea of, what is it about those medications? Are they talking about a physical sensation? Are they talking about that there's a side effect for that medication that makes them feel drowsy or dizzy or extra hungry? Or is it that they feel like because they take medications, they're crazy? More of that perception of their own self-worth. It's important to not ignore those statements. Talking about them can give you a great deal of insight into what that person is experiencing. So you want to validate those things and then get to the core of it. You don't just want to ignore them. But again, you don't have to agree. You don't have to agree at all. I'm not asking you to agree. So that's important too. We also want to talk about compassion fatigue a little bit. And like I said, I'm only going to cover a couple of quick things on this. It's a topic that, like I said, I am extremely passionate about. I know that it is something that is very timely for right now. And most of us who've been in this field for any length of time have had significant periods of compassion fatigue. But compassion fatigue is also called secondary trauma. And what it means is that given what we do, we are often exposed to trauma from other people on a regular basis. We hear their stories, we see their information, we read through their paperwork, and all of their trauma sort of filters through to us. And so we might take on those feelings, we might take on that burden of their trauma, which then leads us to burnout as well, because there's only so much that we can handle, right? There's only so many things we can have piled on our shoulders before we are at the point where we're like, this is just too much. So compassion fatigue happens along with burnout fairly regularly, particularly I think within social services and helping fields. It's rampant. Again, I literally do a presentation on this. I could talk about it for days. Symptoms of compassion fatigue can include, and certainly this is not exhaustive, big reactions, both physical and psychological, to trauma memories that other clients have shared. So their trauma sort of gets transferred onto us at times. Avoidance behavior when we are interacting with our clients, or recalling emotional content and supervision. Might have a limited expression, diminished affect, Somatic complaints. I feel like probably all of you are going, oh my God, this is me. It's normal. That's the good news, guys. Like, we're all in this together, but just being aware of it and then figuring out what to do with it next is not a topic I can get into too much today. But if you guys want that, we can work with Anna to get another one scheduled. We might have negative thinking or a depressed mood. We might have, when we're dealing with secondary trauma, might have heightened arousal, including insomnia. So all of those symptoms and signs of trauma that I talked about way at the beginning, we might be experiencing as well. And then you might experience some detachment from family, friends, from supports, people that you know are reinforcing for you. Now, there's a lot of things that we can do to help work through this, because I think it's important for me to leave a little bit of that with you. This is certainly not as exhaustive as I wish it was at the moment. But there are lots of things that we can do to sort of build ourselves back up. And I think it's important that we take the time to do it, because if not, we leave the field, and what we do is important. Every single one of us has an impact. There's no question in my mind. And so we want to be sure that we can sustain ourselves. One of the first things we can do is remember the meaning of our work. Why is it that we're doing what we're doing? Why is it that we have chosen this field or this type of work? And then maximizing any professional success that we have. One thing that I know here in this office, we try and do a lot is find the positives and stick to them like glue. Even if it is the tiniest little thing, we try and do that. We've had a couple of cases lately where we've had a little shift towards the positive, and we're all really trying to focus on that and stay working on it, because it is so critical to feel that you are doing something important, especially in this field, or that your work is impactful. So we have to be aware of all those professional successes and stay stuck to them. It's important. We have to avoid being super focused on the huge successes, because those don't happen nearly as often as we'd like them to. So if you just constantly wait for the huge successes, you're gonna feel pretty downtrodden and defeated. So relish the little ones. Have some professional self-understanding, and then also some compassion towards yourself. If you know that you are the kind of person who really wants to go 100 miles an hour all the time and never take a break, that is not reality. And you're going to have to force yourself to do the uncomfortable thing and take a break or say no to someone. I'm sure a lot of us are not very good at saying no. That's important. Having a professional greenhouse at work, and then also using professional venting. I think it is completely okay in the workforce at times to use inappropriate and adult language to express your frustrations. I am a cusser by nature. I know when to use it and when not to. And there are times where I just have to vent about the frustrations of my job, and that's okay. Sometimes getting that out of my system can make it that much easier for me to do my job well. Professional greenhouse is really the concept of that things and ideas and people are allowed to grow within their field, within their world, within their job, whether that be more training, additional education, take chances on different programs or things that you want to try in the house, or not in the house, excuse me, within the agency. It's the idea of growth. Being a good enough practitioner, knowing that you cannot be 100% all of the time. You can't give 100% to work and then give 100% to home and then give 100% to your friends. It's not reality. Sometimes you can only give so much, and that's okay. Being aware, especially for people who are relatively new to the field, that imposter syndrome is rampant. And even if you're not new, imposter syndrome is rampant. I've been doing this job for 9 years, and I multiple times each week, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. How did anybody ever give me this job? They were crazy. What were they thinking? It's okay to feel that way. It's okay. And then just really increasing your excitement for the field. If you take a training like this and you're really interested in these topics, explore it more. Take the time and read some other books or attend some webinars or do some TED Talks or whatever it is that helps you feel more invested in the field, do it. Set some goals for yourself and stick to them. It's also important for us to know our stressors and know what is difficult for us or what might be traumatizing for us. Know, are there things that sort of challenge whether or not we're competent at our job? If you're someone who's doing therapy, and most of us are in some way or another, is that process frozen? It's okay if it's frozen. The ice will thaw, you'll get somewhere. It may take some while though. Breaches in peer relationships, and then crises in our own personal lives. And I think those lines right now are extra thin, where there's a lot of times where it's relatively easy to sort of keep a big difference between your personal life and your professional life and really compartmentalize them. But I think given that the world right now is really intense and that there are a number of just things going on, right? Life is just super, super stressful. We've all been in this heightened awareness for the better part of 18 months, almost 2 years now. Those lines are harder than ever to not blur, because I think probably most of us, if we get a phone call or a text message, especially if it's someone we don't talk to on a regular basis, we're all sort of geared up and ready for maybe more serious and devastating news. So it's important that we know all of those things and try and build ourselves back up so that we can continue to do what we're doing. We only have like 5 minutes left, guys, and I want to open it up for questions. I'm also going to put my email address and Anna's email address in the chat box. You can email me or Anna for the slides for the presentation. We can hand those out definitely. CEUs will probably be out within the next 2 weeks or so. But again, if you haven't gotten them within that time frame, shoot me or Anna an email. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate that. If people don't have questions, you are welcome to leave and go about the rest of your day. And hopefully you've gotten anything from this that is helpful. That's my goal, is for you guys to hopefully leave a little bit better than you were earlier. Anything that you want to ask me about, please feel free to. Even if you don't want to do it within the more open forum, please feel free to email me anytime. I'll do what I can. Thanks, guys. This is really validating for me too. I appreciate it. Some days I don't feel like I'm doing a whole heck of a lot, so I appreciate it from you guys too. So yeah, if nobody has any questions, I'll hang on for just a couple of minutes. But please, if you're done, feel free to leave. That's fine. We'll get you CEUs, and just keep doing what you're doing. What you do is important. Your work is important. You are valuable. Elizabeth, we will email them out. Toy, I'm not sure if I understand your question. Growth in an organization. Okay, never mind. I think I do now. I would say maybe more OBM, right? Or becoming, I'm assuming that you're talking about growth and how to grow as a BCBA. More OBM stuff is always a great way to look into things. Doing more training with staff. I think that's always really great too. And just honing in on your passions within the field of ABA and what it is that you want to grow in. No, Hannah, you don't have to. That's fine. I know some people are providing their email. That's fine. We should have it all from people who registered. You're good to go. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Like I said, the email for myself and Anna, actually, I put a bit in there one more time. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to email either one of us. We are happy to help. Oh, I want face-to-face trainings again too. Very much so. As much as I don't mind doing these via Zoom, they're so much more fun in person. All right, everybody, have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your week. Bye.